Well, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to Inkuru Library Virtual Talk. My name is Omar Ndizeye, and I'm a founder of the Inkuru Library. It was founded in 2024 just to serve as a space, a research center, a digital museum dedicated to engage people across generations to the memorization of genocide and knowledge exchange, and also enabling people to tell their stories. In today's conversation, as you might have seen, we are going to have a conversation with Emerging Rwandan Scholars. These are people who have dedicated their life in studying Rwanda, but also study different subjects related to Rwanda. Today, conversation is going to be about young people born after the 1994 genocide against Tutsi in Rwanda. We might ask ourselves, who are they? Who are these people who were born from, who are these children of this generation? Because some of them are no longer children. They are responsible parents, they are responsible readers in different offices. But who are they? Who are these people born from wounded survivors, raped women during the 1994 genocide against Tutsi? People who are born from returnees, people whose parents are former perpetrators of genocide, or people who were born among them, who are born from the historical marginalized people. This is a generation that inherited the whole story of Rwanda, because after the 1994 genocide against Tutsi in Rwanda, the story of a country, our collective story, is told on TVs, on radios, right now on internet. The story of our country story is no longer private to our parents. It's on screens, in the hands of young people, in the hands of adults who were born after genocide, as well as other people, other population of Rwanda born before genocide. In the recent statistics, it is say that 70% of Rwandans, 75% of Rwandans are young people. That means then more than a half of the population were born after the genocide. So by asking ourselves, who are they? There is also another need for those who attend the commemoration. You hear a lot of people who says, let's tell our story, let's communicate, let's write about our story. But which story are we writing? Which story this young generation, this generation born after genocide, is telling their peers, the world in general, where they go? Which story they inherited from their parents? It's the same story we are discussing today, but again, this is a story they inherited, as we say. What are the consequences which came from that transmission of memory? What are the intergenerational trauma that comes from this transmission process? To discuss this topic today, we are with knowledgeable people, as I told you. We are with someone who is doing a wonderful work at, in her PhD thesis at Johns Hopkins University, where her research is focusing more on exploring the transmission of memory in post-genocide Rwanda by analyzing historical, political, economic, and cultural dynamics to eliminate the overlooked narratives. Help me to welcome Sandrine Mugenga, Irankunda, who's going to take us through her research, as I mentioned, much more on the transmission of memory. As I mentioned also, we are going to also reflect on the consequences, much more psychological consequences or psychological effects that comes with this transmission, but also not only this transmission, but other psychological effects that came with the past of Rwanda, but also in the environment, the way would be what we have in environment, the TVs, the social media, the conversation in general at our collective level. To dive deep into that topic, we are with Jessica Bonumwezi, who is a tenure-track assistant professor of psychology at Loyola University in Maryland. Jessica has published 20 academic publications, and she's cited in many research works. Jessica's research focus much more on intergenerational trauma in the post-genocide Rwanda, with primarily where she focused on primary result of transmission of memory, and she's also very active in talking about the psychological effects of genocide. But also, she doesn't research on Rwanda because her research focuses also on American society, where she focuses much more on minorities. Without delaying, because we had taken some minutes before we start, it's now my pleasure to invite Sandrine Mugenga Irankunda to deliver her presentation. She will be followed by just Dr. Jessica Bonumwezi, as I mentioned. After that, we are going to have a conversation about their presentation, and you will have a time also to ask them some questions or to share your ideas as well. Sandrine Mugenga Irankunda.
Thank you so much, Omar, for convening this panel discussion. And thank you all of you for being here and for taking time on a Saturday before Labor Day weekend to listen to this. So thank you so much. I think these topics and this conversation are extremely important, and not just from an academic perspective, but also from our community perspective. I think it is through this type of conversation that we can bring full and holistic healing to ourselves and also to our communities. So I'm really honored to be here alongside my brilliant co-panelist, Dr. Jessica Bonumwezi. So during my research, I stumbled upon her dissertation, and I just felt like such a sense of connection and recognition. I just felt really seen in her research. And I think that's why it's really important to have Rwandan scholars producing knowledge on Rwanda. So thank you, everyone, for being here. I want to start this conversation by talking about a concept that I think is not studied as widely as we've studied genocide or other concepts, and it's the concept of memoricide. I think it's really important for us to understand that, because I think when we think and talk about genocide, we focus on the most visible and recognized aspect, which is the mass destruction of physical bodies. And we do that it's very understandable that we do that. Even our laws, our institutions, we're focusing on the killing and the physical destruction. But genocide extends beyond that. Genocide is more, it extends beyond that destruction of a targeted group in the present. It also involves the destruction of a targeted group in the present, but also in the past and in the future. And that's what makes genocide such an incomprehensible evil, and that's what distinguishes it from war crimes or from mass atrocity, like other types of mass atrocity, is that this is seeking the complete erasure of a people in the present, but also it reaches back in the past to destroy their memories, their history, their culture, and then also in the future by preventing people from reproducing and keeping their group going. So the killing of memory, which is known as memoricide, can take many different forms. And in the past, it's taken forms of destroying cultural sites. So, for example, during the colonial period, we saw where many cultural site languages were destroyed, which is really a killing of a group of people. Or it can be a destruction of library, which contains the historical ideas and concepts of those people, or churches or synagogue, anything that can represent a group. But I argue that it can also be on a more personal and intimate level. And I think that's what happened in 1994 in Rwanda. Memoricide can also be the destruction of photograph, the destruction of personal documents or other family artifacts. And this can also have a very devastating psychological effect and lasting wounds, even though churches might not have been destroyed, but not having anything from your family can also have a lasting impact. And many survivors in Rwanda have recounted how perpetrators took deliberate care to burn, for example, photo albums to ensure that every trace of the victim was erased. And I've met many people who were young at the time or who were not even born, who have no visual memory of their family or their family member because there is not a single photo, there is not a single clothing, there is not a family artifact, no jewelry, nothing that they can hold on to even give them proof that their family existed. And so that's something that I think we don't study enough, but that's really important. And the reason I start with memoricide is because I think that's where most young Rwandans start. When we're trying to make sense of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, many of us start without any memory of our own because we were either very young or we were not born yet. So we don't have any of our own memories. And we start without any material trace, as I just mentioned. There is nothing material that you can hold on to show you what your history is, where your loved one, what your loved ones looked like. And so in this space, these young people, the younger generation, they're forced to reconstruct personal histories. They're forced to reconstruct their own identity from scratch. Before I go further, though, I want to note the obvious. We don't all have the same experience. We're not a monolith. There's some young Rwandans who've had very different experiences. There's some who are orphans who don't have a single person left on the face of the earth who knows them, who can tell them any history. There's some of people who have parents, one or both parents, who are frozen into silence, who don't want to speak about what happened. And there's some who are lucky to have some who might be able to engage and talk about what happened to a certain extent or a certain degree. So we all have different experiences, but I still think we all still have some things in common. And so those are some of the things that I want to discuss. One of the thing I think we all have in common, even though we don't have our own memories, even though we might not have physical, tangible things to hold on to, I think we all have this demarcation in our mind. We intuitively know that there was life before the genocide and there was life after the genocide. Like genocide in Rwandan culture and the Rwandan experience is something that has a demarcation that really makes you feel like there are two different worlds. And so the younger generation, many times, I think can feel trapped in the after without any knowledge of the before. And that can be extremely difficult to understand your roots, your identity when you don't have any way to connect to the before. And scholars have shown that a group memory, when it's so severely disrupted by something like a genocide, a Holocaust, those kind of things can make the group members feel a sense of dislocation, feel a sense of being lost in the world because you don't have access to the historical groundings and the personal narratives that ground your identity. And so it can be really difficult to make sense of the future if we don't address that. Another thing that I think we have, many of us have in common is that demarcation is often accompanied by silence. The majority of families turned to silence. Silence is a common coping mechanism for survivors, not just in Rwanda, in Bosnia, it's been proven in Cambodia with the Jewish community. Just the horror is so great that many people are just frozen into silence, you know. genocide alone is really difficult to integrate in rational thought. It's really difficult to explain it, let alone to find the words to like express it. Certain atrocities just, transcend language, I would say. And I think like being wanting to be exterminated, like being part of a group that was going to be exterminated, is something that's really difficult to put into language. So many parents remain silent, and the silence is aimed at protecting the children, also protecting themselves. Because, how do you tell a child that they were marked for death from the moment they were born? So instead, parents focus on raising the kids because life has to go on. We have to build a country. We have to keep it moving. And so silence becomes very common and very prevalent. But silence does not prevent trauma from being transmitted. And I know Dr. Jessica is probably going to talk about it and this fascinating topic of intergenerational trauma that can still occur even when there is silence. And so that silence, again, it means that these young people, they don't have memories, they don't have narratives because there is silence. There is this demarcation where they can feel there is no way of grounding yourself because you don't really have this thing connecting you to the past. And so they really have to reconstruct what happened to their families, what happened to their country by themselves. And I think many young people have experienced that one or another. Again, we all have different experiences, but this is something that I think a lot of us have gone through. And so I think many of the young people can piece together a narrative for themselves that is based on what they overhear with their family. So you overhear things from your family, from neighbors, what you learn at school, what they experience at different commemorative events, what they experience when they visit different museums or memorials, what they see on social media, what is portrayed in the arts, like through films, literature, music, all those kind of forms of art, and they piece together their own narrative and they construct their history. And I think there are also many young people in the second generation who feel like for them to confront their parents and ask them is asking their parents to relive their traumatic experiences, and that's not something they want to do. And again, I say relive because I don't think there's any way to discuss traumatic events without reliving them. So even though it feels like it's the past, even though we feel like it's been 31 years, when someone who has lived through it has to share it with their children or even anyone else, they're transported back to that time, and it can be very traumatic. So I think what the younger generation do is to have to create and kind of create their own narrative and learn about their own history on their own. And I find that it's really powerful because many of them have done it and they have been able to fight against this erasure that was supposed to be brought onto them. And this reconstruction of their family histories, of their memories, I think is a way to reclaim their identity as well. In like similar to how the perpetrator reached back into the past to destroy, the survivor basically reached back into the past, but this time to restore and recover memories. And one thing that I find really powerful is when the older generation have done this and written books. And I think these are really, really important for the younger generation. Many in the older generation have done it or are still working on it, where they have confronted the trauma in a way and reached back into the past to write. They have done research, conducted extensive research, for academic purposes or just for their own memoirs, and they write about their families, and this is a way to immortalize these memories and this family. And this is such a gift for the younger generation because then they can go to those books and they can learn about their history, whether it's their specific family or even their country. And this gives also something tangible, something they can hold on to. And I've read many books or many of these accounts, and even when it's not about your own specific family, we all have such an interconnected history. We all kind of went through the same experiences that it still gives you such an understanding of your history and your identity, and it can really help with the younger people who are reclaiming their past. Other narratives that have helped young people to make sense of the genocide that happened in Rwanda includes the national commemorative events and spaces such as like museum and memorials. Those are really important as well. I grew up in Rwanda, and every April I was immersed in the commemoration, whether it was on television or on radio, listening to survivors' testimony. And this really profoundly influenced how I saw myself and how I placed myself in the history of our country. country. So when I moved here to the United States, I realized that there are many young people who don't have that, who didn't grow up with that experience of having these commemorative events where our history is shared, where we talk about the colonial legacy, where we talk about the ethnic tensions, or we talk about the propaganda that was used, or just even the very meaning of what genocide is. And so that was not widely understood if a lot of times if they came and lived abroad at a young age. So those young people who are in the diaspora can have a very different experience where they don't have a lot of the understanding that we have. And so in our community, I was living in Atlanta, we started organizing the Kwibuka commemoration. And I remember the first time we did it, like afterwards, we gathered with some young people and we just started reflecting and processing, and they were asking questions. Again, things that I thought were very elementary because I had heard them growing up. They had not had that experience and they don't have the parents telling them anything. And so this can also be a really great space for them to learn about the history and their place in that history. These events and the memorial, they really remain vital for the young people so they can carry forward that history and also pass it on. And we have seen in Rwanda, for example, we've seen initiative, for example, the one that's called Our Past Initiative that is led by young people. And it's about learning our history. And they do it in such a creative way. They have theater. They also do like workshops. And they go beyond just understanding history and also helping survivors. And so those type of initiatives are things that younger people, the younger generation is engaging in to be able to make sense of what happened to them. And um, I find it very, very refreshing. And there are other ways. I mean, of course, no one can list many ways. Everyone have their own way of understanding their history and reconstructing this. But I want to highlight a couple that I find are very creative, that I find are very specific and unique to the younger generation. And they have found a very creative way of making sense of it. One is through photographs. As I mentioned, memoricide, or like the killing of memory, can really impact photograph. And you can feel like it's a small thing. You can think that it's not a huge deal, but it can be a really huge deal for someone to grow up not knowing what your parents looked like, not knowing what your uncles looked like, and you have no way to like fix this or recreate this. And so finding photograph, whether it's photograph that survived the genocide that were now completely destroyed, or maybe sometimes I've heard testimonies where people had family abroad who were able to send them pictures that they had, and that's a way for you to reconnect with your family. So there's some young people who launched initiative to restore these photographs that are badly in bad shape, or like that have redrawn families, to give this tangible and to basically have this proof that these families existed. And there's a project called Art for Memories that is also done by young people in Rwanda, and it's free of charge. And what they have, or what they have explained their mission to be, is to provide lasting evidence of existence. And I found that to be really powerful, that these young people are deciding, like, they might not have their own memories, they might not have these tangible items that show, but they can recreate it. They can create this evidence of existence. In this way, the act of preserving and recovering, it becomes more than restoration. I think it's also like an archive in a way. And I personally related a lot because I can count on one hand how many pictures my family have, like maybe 5. And even those, you carry them so they're so precious to you. So being able to restore them, to recreate, I think that's such a powerful and creative way that the younger generation has engaged in this. Another way has been to inscribe memories on their bodies in the form of tattoos. And this is not just done by Rwandans, of course. I've read papers about the Bosnian young people who, all the young men of that generation all had very similar tattoos because they all decided this is the way we're going to honor the memories of our lost loved ones. And so they inscribed names of family members, birth date, death dates, and they basically you can see them as a walking memorial. They become walking memorials to their loved ones. Others have taken more creative ways of doing this through fashion. For example, when I was writing my paper, I was looking for different ways the Rwandans have done this. And I met a young Rwandan woman who wore a dress for her graduation, and the way to honor her father was to have a picture of her father on that graduation dress. And I thought that was so cool. And I was like, can I please put you in my paper, because this is such a nice way to like keep that memory. So I share this example just to show how creative it can be. It doesn't have to just be books. There, like, I think the young people, this generation, have found ways that even though they don't have their own memories, they can still connect in different ways. And so they have a way to reimagine and integrate these memories into their everyday life. So I will close by noting that I think the identity with the younger generation in Rwanda is not only built on trauma. Yes, trauma is part of our experience, and there is no escaping it. But I also think there is resilience when we hear what the parents or the older generation went through their books or the testimony, or as they're also becoming more comfortable with sharing. But we also have this creativity in reimagining the future that I think is really, really powerful. And so when we read what the parents wrote, I think that resilience is passed down. And I've read also, and I'm sure Dr. Jessica has more information on this, or like will know more, is that the same way trauma is passed on, is the same way resilience can also be passed on. And so there can be this transmission that's not just limited to trauma, but also resilience. And so that's what some of the things I wanted to highlight as we think about the generation that was born after the genocide, that was really, really young, and how they kind of make sense of what happened. So I will now pass it on to Dr. Jessica Bonumwezi to also talk about her topic, I think focusing on the transmission of trauma. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandrine. I feel like I'm glad that you came first, because so much of what I'm going to talk about is going to be kind of building on what you talked about. Well, kind of this silence, this kind of search for identity, this like trying to this generation's desire and need to like find themselves in this history. So yeah, so basically a lot of my research looks at kind of the impact that has on their mental health and this kind of intergenerational transmission of trauma, but also hopefully what we can do about it and how we can kind of harness the power of storytelling, the power of transmission of memory to kind of foster healing in both the parents' generation and this kind of post-genocide youth generation. But yeah, so first, before we can start talking about intergenerational trauma, we have to start in kind of the mental health of this post-genocide generation. We really have to start with the parents' generation. So for instance, there's a recent nationwide epidemiological study that looked at the rates of mental health conditions in Rwanda, and that found that in the parents' generation, in the general Rwandan community, there was about kind of that about 23% of women and 16% of men had some kind of mental health condition. Now, when you look at genocide survivors specifically, these numbers were astronomically higher. Around one in two genocide survivor had some kind of mental health condition. So it was around 48% of men and 53% of women. So really high rates when you compare it to kind of the global trend, which usually tend to be in like the low tens or around kind of single digits. So nothing compared to this kind of 50% rates that we see in genocide survivors. In addition to that, the research found that in addition to this really high need for mental health services, and actually awareness of mental health services seemed to be high. In genocide survivors, it was around 76% who reported knowing about available services. And in the general population, it was around 60%. But despite this, the use of mental health services was really low in the parent generation. So around 14% of survivors and around 5% of the general Rwandan community reported using mental health services. And so we'll come back to this later when we're talking about kind of recovery and what does this mean when thinking about interventions for how to address this intergenerational trauma. But I wanted to start by sharing that. Now, when we look at youth, so we don't have as much of kind of as much data on the mental health of the young generation that was born after the genocide or that was young during the genocide. But in the study that we did, where we looked at specifically kind of youth that identified as genocide survivors, so this was either youth that were survivors themselves, but that were too young to kind of personally identify with that identity of survivor and identified one with being a descendant of a survivor. So usually kind of this youth that was really young during the genocide or youth that was born from survivor parents after the genocide, we found that the rates were quite high as well. We found that around 42% had PTSD and 37% had anxiety or depression. And these numbers are actually, when you look at the specific mental health conditions in the parent generation, you see lower numbers than that. So we didn't, unfortunately, in our study, we didn't have numbers for the percentage of youth that had any kind of mental health condition. But usually when you look at the specific prevalence rates of conditions like PTSD and depression and anxiety in the parent generation, you find numbers in the 20s, 30s. So suggesting that the rates of mental health concerns in general in youth are actually higher than in the parent generation, which is quite paradoxical. When you think about it, because you would think that the parents who experience the event themselves would have way higher rates of mental illness than you would find in their children who don't have direct memories of this trauma, but you actually find the opposite. And we'll go into why this could be in a bit. But kind of touching also on the use of mental health services, you would think that in a kind of generation that was raised on social media, where we have kind of all this, I feel like destigmatization of mental health and this kind of where we kind of constantly talk about, I feel about mental health in our generation, that there would be way higher rates of mental health service use, but we actually found the opposite, that only about 2% of youth reported having used mental health services in Rwanda, which again is quite concerning given these really high rates of mental health conditions. So now going kind of talking directly about this phenomenon of intergenerational trauma. If you're not familiar with the topic, it's basically this idea that trauma experienced by one generation can affect the health and well-being of individuals in subsequent generation. And this emerged as a field in really the 1960s when clinicians started realizing that children of Holocaust survivors were reporting to treatment with really similar symptoms as their parents. They were talking about kind of reliving these memories and having these flashbacks and have all these PTSD-like symptoms of kind of life in concentration camps, even though they were born after World War II. So the field really started kind of reckoning with like, what is this? Like, why are we seeing such distress, but also where we're seeing exactly the same presentation that we would expect if these children had experienced the Holocaust themselves, even though they have no direct memories of it. So that spurred really kind of this all this research and all this these investigations, looking at this topic of intergenerational trauma, which also has been called a bunch of other terms like transgenerational trauma, multi-generational trauma, cross-generational trauma. But overall, looking at like how is this? Like what could be leading to this? And this has been investigated in a variety of settings. This has been there's evidence suggesting that this phenomenon occurs in a variety of genocide survivor communities. So there's research in the Armenian genocide survivor community, survivors of the Khmer genocide in Cambodia, survivors of other atrocities like the Holodomor in Ukraine, Japanese American internment camps, historical trauma, communities affected by historical trauma, like African American communities or Native American communities. There's been evidence looking at this from kind of various like historical waves of violence in the Israel-Palestine conflict, other forms of trauma like terrorism, for instance. This has been equally demonstrated in children of 9/11 survivors, so people who were in the towers during 9/11. And even it's started being looked at as well in people who have experienced like non-terror related or non-conflict related forms of trauma, like childhood trauma. But generally, all the research converges in showing that having a parent who's experienced this trauma leads to a lot of symptoms in children around kind of difficulties with mood regulation, identity development, as Sandrine talked about earlier, interpersonal functioning, and just generally higher psychological distress and vulnerability to stress. So for instance, and specifically looking at kind of mental health disorders, research has consistently demonstrated that children of survivors, especially of genocide survivors, have higher prevalence rates of disorders like PTSD, depression, anxiety, eating disorders, and substance use disorders. Um, In Rwanda specifically, this research started kind of in around 2014 and started finding very similar results that children of survivors, when compared to kind of the general Rwandan community, or even when they're compared to people who are in the country and are not targeted, to children of people who are in the country and not targeted, to people who are outside of the country and returned after the genocide, these children tend to be about to have higher prevalence of things like PTSD and depression, but also tend to have about 73% higher odds of developing PTSD. So that it's quite a drastic difference that can't just be explained by kind of what their experience was like growing up, that there's kind of something way deeper going on here. And the research has also found that this kind of transmission, that the symptoms in children are way worse when their own parents have PTSD symptoms or suffer from PTSD. We also started finding in the kind of the 2017, 2019 that things like IHAMK, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's basically these experiences during commemoration activities where people really kind of start like very vividly reliving and re-experiencing the genocide. And we used to think that this is something that can only happen to people who directly experience the genocide. And around 2017, a research study was done that found that about 20% of those who experience Ihamuka episodes during the commemoration were actually born after. So there were children without any actual direct memories of the genocide, and yet they kind of had these experiences of reliving and re-experiencing an event that they never actually lived. So this, of course, has very drastic impacts when you think about the fact that in Rwanda, the around the genocide, the birth rate was around six children per woman. So if you imagine like a genocide survivor who has this, let's say, this PTSD symptoms, and the potential that six children for each survivor could be affected by intergenerational trauma, the numbers are quite huge, especially when you think about the kind of the fact that the mental health system and infrastructure in Rwanda is still so kind of underdeveloped and still really underfunded, and that there's still like a really severe lack of mental health providers. But in addition to that, there's additional reasons for concern. One of the additional reasons is that the literature from Holocaust survivors suggests that parents who were exposed to the Holocaust as children were more likely to transmit trauma than those who experienced it as adults. And this suggests that we might see similar trends in Rwanda, where parents who were exposed to the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi as children might be more likely to transmit its effects to their children. And research showed that about 66% of survivors were under the age of 22 during the genocide, suggesting that that generation was quite actually like was a large percentage of survivors. And those those youth survivors who were young at the time of the genocide are now between kind of 31 years old and 53 years old, and either have young children whose symptoms might not have been kind of manifesting yet, or are starting to kind of start families, and that we're likely to see kind of an increasing trend in kind of these symptoms related to intergenerational trauma in Rwanda. And lastly, additional reason for concern, one last reason for concern is the fact that we actually don't know how far this extends. So research in kind of animal models suggests that it could go up to 4 generations of transmission. We know that from the historical trauma literature, like looking at communities like Native Americans, that we don't really see an end, that there's not like, oh, after like the grandchild generation, like we're good, there's no reason to worry. That we see that we don't really see an end to this transmission, and that we know at least from the Holocaust survivor literature that it at least extends to grandchildren of survivors, suggesting that again, these numbers are only going to kind of exponentially grow larger in terms of this concern. Now you might be thinking like, okay, what is going on here? Like, how is that? And specifically, like, why could it be that we're seeing even worse symptoms in children than we see in the parents? And there's a few reasons for this. One is actually just pure biology. So research has found that there is a biological kind of mechanism of transmission, that kind of experiencing a traumatic event has a genetic impact on not the gene itself, but on what we call epigenetic modifications, where basically there's a change to kind of the not the gene itself, but the kind of the casing of the gene where it affects how the gene is read and how the gene is transcribed. So basically how the gene behaves in the future, and that those changes, those biological and epigenetic changes are experienced by the parents and then passed on to their children. And that this is what leads to symptoms in the parents, and this is why, again, when transmitted to children, leads to symptoms in the children as well. So there is quite consistent evidence showing this kind of biological mechanism of transmission. And there's, in addition to that, which I think could kind of speak to the additive effects and to kind of these really high rates of mental health concerns in children. There's, in addition to this biological mechanism, there's also psychosocial mechanisms of transmission. So research suggests that things like parenting styles have a really strong impact on children's symptoms. So things often in genocide survivors, we see kind of really dysfunctional parenting styles, things like being really overprotective of their children out of this fear that they're going to kind of, the world is a really harsh place, and they need to protect their children, that this overprotectiveness can really harm children and kind of their ability to feel safe in the world and their ability to kind of grow up to be well-adjusted adults who don't have kind of this excessive anxiety about existing in the world. We see that parenting styles that have to do with like emotional unavailability or rejecting, often parents who are traumatized have a really hard time connecting emotionally to their children and being present emotionally with their children, and that this can lead to symptoms in children. We see that often when parents are so wounded that they struggle to function in everyday life, often children are forced to play the role of the parent, and kind of there's this role reversal where children feel the need to take care of their parents emotionally or physically, and that also leads to symptoms in children. We also see things like kind of dysfunction, general dysfunction in family dynamics having to do with kind of a lack of communication, kind of a difficulty around attachment, and kind of parents having difficulties connecting to their children, especially at really young ages, and like playing with their children, and all of that leading to symptoms in children related to intergenerational trauma. But the biggest factor, I'm a little bit biased because this is really what my research focuses on, but I also feel like from conversations with survivors, it really seems like it's a big crucial factor that's actually been overlooked in a lot of the literature, is really this silence that Sandrine was talking about. This kind of we actually there's a term in the field called this conspiracy of silence, that in genocide survivor families we tend to find that parents are really hesitant to talk about their experience of trauma, and kind of seem to have this inability that even when they know that it's good for the children, when they want to, they really still struggle to do it. And that in addition to that, the children themselves also really seem to have an inability to push for that conversation out of a fear to like wound the parents or kind of make them re-experience. The children want to know, but really feel unable to kind of push their parents or tell them. Like it creates this phenomenon where there's silence on all sides, where there's really kind of this people being frozen into silence. I think Sandrine described it, and I think that's a really good depiction. That even though every single person in that family, whether parent or child, wants to talk about it, they seem to be really unable to. And this kind of lack of communication in the family around the trauma seems to really be highly linked to symptoms of intergenerational trauma and to kind of this transmission of intergenerational trauma. So Sandrine described this really well, so I won't go into as much detail. But we tend to see that children know that something happened. They are kind of intuitively aware that there's a before and there's an after, and there's kind of this seismic event that kind of affected the family that has very strong implications on the parents, but they don't really know the details. Like many of them can't really tell you what their parents experienced. Many of them have very little memory or knowledge of the loved ones that they lost. Like they're aware that this person existed. They may know a name. They may have seen a picture if the family has a picture, which is not common, but that's about it. Like they can't tell you about the person. It's like having like members of your family that you've never met and that you know nothing about. That there's kind of these holes in in their knowledge that are quite significant. And in addition to that, research has found that these children tend to have what we call like a lack of a coherent narrative. That even when they know things, it's kind of things that have been kind of dropped in conversation, like really randomly. There's no kind of narrative of the trauma and what happened and making sense of it. Like there is very much like just random things that they're picking up, kind of trying to like crumbs that they're picking up from the parents, or that often they're picking up from commemoration activities, or that they may have heard during kind of gachacha proceedings, or they may have heard from like neighbors or the media or schools, like that kind of they're trying to piece together this history by themselves, often with very little help or very little ability of kind of checking this with their parents and kind of checking the accuracy of this narrative. And that often leads to just filling in the gaps with incorrect information because they can't really double check that with the parents and know the kind of the correct information, or just being left to imagine the worst because they don't really know what the parents experience. So often they're kind of guessing, right? They're seeing the impact on their parents' mental health. They're seeing kind of the parents' behavior and kind of filling in the gaps and making educated guesses about what happened and what it means. And this, of course, has horrible implications for the children's mental health because of kind of this grappling with the history that they don't really know. But it also has very strong negative implication, as we found, on things like reconciliation attitudes and kind of attitudes towards perpetrators or children of perpetrators, or just what we consider like an outgroup, like people who are not genocide survivors or children of survivors. So we found that often because of this lack of communication, children are guessing, are kind of guessing like who to interact with, who it's okay to interact with, who it's okay to kind of have relationships with in the community based on their parents' kind of untold experiences or perspectives. So often we've heard so many stories in our work with, for instance, children who guess from the fact that the parents seem to like talk to some people in the community and not others, are like, oh, so that family is not okay for me to talk to, or I can't be friends with a child from that family because there's something. I don't know what it is. I can't really ask my parent, but there's something. And or often kind of concluding, sometimes erroneously, of like, oh, that person looks this way, so I'm not gonna be friends with them because my parents wouldn't like it, or just a lot of a guessing game and kind of trying to piece together an identity, uh, um, often trying to piece together kind of an understanding of the world around them based on really very little information. Um, and thankfully, I feel like I should end on a positive note. I feel like I've talked about really negative and really kind of depressing facts. But there is, I think, some hope. So some interventions, for instance, that focus on reconciliation have really started thinking about how do we not just try to address reconciliation in the parents' generation and kind of between victims and perpetrators and community members, but also think about the children and how that history has impacted them, and how can we make efforts to also bring together kind of the post-genocide generation and make sure that they're not left behind in that kind of reconciliation effort. We also are starting to see some interventions specifically targeting intergenerational trauma. This is brand new. I myself became aware of this intervention last year. Our team is also working on another intervention, but there's kind of starting to be this push in Rwanda to specifically design interventions that try to address this lack of communication around the genocide in families. So interventions that bring together parents and their children and create spaces where we can kind of figure out how to have this conversation and figure out how to help the parents be able to tell this history, and also help the children be able to ask the questions that they really have that have been unanswered so far, and how we can create environments and spaces in the community where that can occur in a way that's supported and in a way that also doesn't kind of re-traumatize the parents, re-traumatize the parents, or kind of lead to further trauma, unintended trauma in the second generation, this post-genocide generation. So I'd say that there's a lot of kind of positive things to look forward to. Unfortunately, all of this is very new. So I think the field of intergenerational trauma is very new in general. And specifically in Rwanda, it's quite new. Like we've only been even looking at that for the last 10 or so years. But I'll say in the last couple of years, we're really starting to see a recognition of the fact that we really have to do something about this, and we're starting to see like interventions specifically that are being designed or modified to really try to address this. So come back in a couple of years and hopefully I should have more positive things to report. I'll pass it back to you, Omar.
Thank you so much, Jessica, Dr. Jessica and Sandrine Mugenga, for this wonderful presentation. I guess everyone who attended this conversation today understand why it's now timely to discuss such topic in post-genocide Rwanda. You discussed about silence. I think both of you mentioned